What does Kelly Clarkson have to do with you as a manager? Plenty. In this video, we'll break it down. So last week, Rolling Stone magazine issued an expose on the Kelly Clarkson Show. In it, it talked about allegations from several staffers, and they weren't directed at Kelly Clarkson herself. In fact, numerous of the staffers said they didn't think that Kelly was actually aware of what happened and described her as kind. But in it, it talked about a senior producer, other senior staffers, and things that they did, like yelling, swearing, throwing of a stapler, and when employees raised questions about diversity, getting mad at those employees. Now, interestingly, in the article, it said that employees had gone to HR and raised concerns, waiting for something to happen. In one instance, an HR representative supposedly told an employee that they found behavior to be unprofessional. But what happened to the producers that were subject of that complaint? They weren't fired like employees expected. They were promoted. So employees saw that they went to HR and things didn't happen. Now, when that happens, there can be outcomes where employees say, well, we're going to go elsewhere. For most employers, you're not going to be in Rolling Stone. That's just not going to happen. But where you are likely to be is in exit interviews, or Glassdoor, or on the lips of people that leave, that talk about what the reality is of working day to day. So in this video, we'll talk about 3 common things that were the subjects of that article that happen all too often in workplaces around the US and the world, and that you can work on to have a better organization. The first is that managers need to understand what to do when you get concerns. As a manager, rarely do you get the kind of training that you should about taking in employee complaints. In some places, you have to have certain required training, like California, some other states have required anti-harassment training. But in a lot of places, it's not required, so it just doesn't happen. Or maybe it happens once when people start, but they forget about it. Rarely are managers explained to what you need to know. Because managers, once you hear an allegation of a workplace concern, have an obligation to do something about it. Now, it's not necessarily prescribed what that do something about it has to be. Just because someone raises a complaint about someone doesn't mean that person needs to be fired. But a manager can't keep it inside. And so what can happen is a couple things. One is an employee will sometimes say to a manager, this happened, but please don't tell anybody. I don't want to make a formal complaint. And the manager may think they're being nice and say, absolutely, your secret's safe with me. If I see anything concerning, I'll do something about it. But the problem is, once a manager knows about a complaint in an organization, it can be the same as the CEO knowing or every manager knowing. That can be legally, especially when those concerns touch on things like behavior directed to a certain gender, race, or other protected category. So managers trying to keep things secret to help that employee aren't helping anybody at all. So it's critical that managers are taught what to do in that situation. Another times, if managers aren't trained, they may go tell people, but it may be more gossipy or talking to managers to commiserate, like, my employee told me this, what do I do? And that problem is managers that are spreading information to too many channels and not keeping it confidential. Because if you read handbook policies, often they'll say, raise a concern to any manager, and the information will be kept confidential. There always needs to be a caveat when employees make concerns, that it's as confidential as possible. Because if a manager is told information, you can't truly keep it confidential to do something about it. You may have to talk to HR or another individual like that, and other people may need to know. But you have to keep that pool as small as possible. But so it's important that managers be trained exactly what to do when people bring concerns. Sometimes that will touch on legal topics, again, things like something aimed at a gender or race. Other times it's just people being a jerk at work that isn't necessarily prohibited by law, but isn't the type of environment that organizations want to foster. So managers need to be trained what to do in that situation. What to do when someone raises a concern to them, how you thank them, what you say if someone says keep it secret, and how you train them to talk about it being as confidential as possible, and explain what's going to happen next. Because sometimes managers will say, okay, I'll handle it, but they don't tell the employee who they're going to talk to. So if you're going to talk to somebody from HR, it's important that that employee know, because you don't want them to be surprised when their HR business partner or somebody else picks up the phone to continue the conversation. The communication and transparency are important. So the second step is when HR or others who are responsible for reviewing workplace concerns aren't properly trained as well. And that can happen far too often. Some organizations will have a dedicated team, And some people call them investigators and complaints. Sometimes those words can feel really formal to employees. So I often tend to talk about employees who are responsible for reviewing concerns and addressing concerns. But whatever you have, if it's an HR team or a separate team that looks into those, it's important that they get more in-depth training. Because your day-to-day people managers often aren't going to be the ones leading investigations, and they don't necessarily need to become junior lawyers or junior HR. But just like those managers need to know what to do when employees bring concerns to them, your HR or whatever reviewing team needs to know exactly what to do in that investigation. So that means talking to that manager, getting the information as much as possible so that employee that raised the concern doesn't just have to repeat the same story over and over again. But having those procedures or expectations so that every time concerns are heard. Because just as I said in the beginning, when someone raises a concern, there can be all sorts of outcomes. What should happen every time is a dedicated review of having a conversation and being looked into. It may involve needing to talk to other people, understanding what you can do to substantiate any type of concerns, but all of those types of steps should be known by that HR team so that you're not reinventing the wheel or treating one concern far differently from another similar concern. So having that type of training for HR or the other review teams is going to be absolutely critical for your organization so that when you have concerns, you know that they've been raised and employees feel like they're treated fairly. Again, that can involve talking to people, reviewing documents, and they can shape day to day what those reviews look like. But having those procedures and understanding what decision makers are going to be for any type of concern and having that as a part of your organization is absolutely critical, especially as organizations grow. At times you do have a responsibility to do that under the law. But even where that's not part of your state or country or locality's laws, having those can meet the expectations that your employees have to come to a safe and welcoming workplace. So making sure HR understands what they're doing and regularly communicating with that individual that raised the concern. Which leads to the third step, which is circling back with the employee that initially raised the concern and anybody else involved in that review if they raise concerns, if applicable. And what I mean by that can vary. Because just like I said, the outcomes can vary in an organization. As I say it, sometimes outcomes of a concern are visible. Someone might get fired, so everyone sees that. Someone may be suspended. Generally, people will see that as well. At times, they can be invisible, meaning that the outcome may be a warning or a conversation, but there should be some sort of outcome. Or it may be that there was a misunderstanding and the concern that was raised wasn't substantiated at all. Whatever that outcome is, from nothing to a firing, it's important to circle back to that employee and share the information that you can. And sometimes organizations will say, what about employee privacy? And it's important to know what employee privacy and any laws that might be at stake, but putting any of those laws aside, as a general matter, communicating to employees exactly what they need to know and what you can share is important. Because in this situation, the Clarkson Show, where employees said, I went and I raised a concern to HR, and then I didn't hear anything, even after maybe they'd had conversations with them, then the assumption is nothing happened to those individuals, and my concern isn't treated seriously. So why would I ever come to raise a concern to you again? And that can have very real implications for companies, because as you get into the law for things like harassment complaints, for organizations, there can be a defense in the U.S. under federal law, for example, called the Farragut-Ellerth defense. And that means if you have a policy and it provides channels for employees to raise concerns, an employee raises a concern and you handle it, well, then you can have certain liability limited under a legal claim if that employee never took advantage of raising internal channels. So if an employee chooses not to report it and just goes straight to court, an employer may say, hey, we have these channels, employee didn't raise this. And that can mean that the employer wins the lawsuit, even if the allegations are concerning. And that can happen from time to time, depending on the case. But what also in those legal situations can happen is an employee may say, well, I didn't raise a concern. And that's because I know if I raised a concern previously, or I know someone that did, and HR never followed up with them. And so what happens at that situation can be a case by case. A judge or whoever can look and say, well, what happened in this situation? Is it reasonable that someone didn't raise an internal complaint? Are you not following, company, those very procedures you're laying out? So it's important that organizations go and look at their policies around raising concerns. whether they're related to discrimination or harassment, or whether it's just general workplace concerns. And making sure that whatever you're talking to employees that you're doing in practice, from having managers know what happens when someone raises a concern, to having HR trained up on these, and to circling back to employees to explain as much as you can. That may be a situation of saying to the employee, we appreciate you raising your concerns. It's always very important to thank employees for doing that. But in this situation, this is what we found, and sharing what you can. Or it may be a situation to say, thank you, this employee, had an outcome, and while they're still employed, we reiterated that, this is not tolerated. These are the steps that they're going through. So again, sharing what you can. But if you don't circle back to an employee, then they may lead to steps. Again, it may not be Rolling Stone, but it most likely is going to be their friends, their family, their coworkers, and potentially Glassdoor and public forums. So all this to say, the Kelly Clarkson Show is getting a lesson. And Kelly Clarkson has said her whole team is going to get leadership training. But it's important that you do this for your organization before you have very public issues. Or if you look now and see that maybe there's concerns that your employees have raised that nothing's been done. As an organization, you have the obligation to make sure you're providing even very basic levels of training to your managers, more robust training to HR, and that you're creating an environment where when people follow the steps you've set out and raise those concerns, that they see you and your organization living those steps in reality. So that's the lesson for today, a lesson that I hope you learn before it becomes a public one, just like the Kelly Clarkson Show has witnessed.